In the history of sound, two young music students, Lionel and David, attend the Boston Conservatory in 1917 and bond over their shared love of folk music. They reconnect a few years later, embarking on a song collecting trip in the backwaters of Maine. The History of Sound is directed by Oliver Hermanus, and he has directed films such as Moffy and Living, and The History of Sound just debuted at the Cannes Film Festival in the official competition and will be released in US cinemas September 12 and will be released in Europe and Australia in January and February. The History of Sound is a pretty disappointing film, but there is a lot to like in this film, especially if you stick around to the second half of the film. The film mainly focuses on Paul Mescal, his character Lionel. He is as I said before, he's a student at the Boston Music Conservatory when he meets David, played by Joshua Connor, and he is a very gifted singer and musical teacher, and he knows everything about music. And throughout the film, his musical prowess allows him a very fruitful career throughout the film. In the first half of the film, we just join Paul Mescal and Joshua Connor. They share a love for music, and they tour the United States collecting folk music, and then they enter into a romantic relationship. But the film doesn't really focus on that relationship very much. We see them talking and joking, and the next scene is one of them in bed naked, and we just assume they've had sex, and then they never really talk about the relationship. They never really talk about what they're doing. And Joshua Connor's character has to go off to World War One, and eventually he comes back, but he doesn't really come back the same person. He's very much has PTSD, and it really affects his life and affects his relationship with Paul Mescal. And Paul Mescal's getting a lot of offers because he's very musically talented, so he ends up leaving Joshua Connor and going to Europe, and he has a nice fruitful career there. And that's basically the last time he ever sees Joshua Connor. And in the second half of the film, we follow, about the middle section of the film, we follow Paul Mescal. He's in a romantic relationship with a young woman, and she's quite wealthy, and I think they've been together for a while, but we see kind of flashbacks of him mourning over his relationship with Joshua Connor. And I think that really, it doesn't matter how much how he tries to convince himself that he's happy in this heterosexual relationship with his partner. I think he kind of still yearns for that life. His time with Joshua Connor was his most enjoyable part of his life. So in the second half of the film, he ends up leaving this young woman and going back to his hometown because his mother passes away. And when he goes back to his hometown, he tries to find Joshua Connor, but we find out that Joshua Connor has passed away already. And then so the second half of the film is just Paul Mescal kind of reminiscing about his time with Joshua Connor. But because this relationship between Paul Mescal and Joshua Connor is just so light, they don't really have much chemistry, and it's not really their fault. The two performances are fine, Paul Mescal and Joshua Connor, they're fine, but Joshua Connor is barely in the film, and his character is not developed very well, and the film doesn't really give them enough of a chance to build some kind of deep romance or any kind of chemistry. We get a flashback in the second half of the film of Paul Mescal and Joshua Connor talking about the relationship, are we doing something wrong here? Do you feel afraid? But it kind of just touches on that a little bit. So in the second half of the film, when Paul Mescal is mourning over the loss of his friend and his relationship with Joshua Connor, it's hard to sympathize with him because the film doesn't really delve into that relationship very much. I did find a lot of the aspect in the second half of the film quite interesting. Paul Mescal, he really does carry the film. He does give a very strong performance in this film. And in the second half of the film, when Paul Mescal is talking to people that Joshua Connor know, apparently Joshua Connor, he got married after Paul Mescal left for Europe, and Paul Mescal meets his widow, and it's kind of a elephant in the room because I think his widow knew that Paul Mescal and Joshua in like a homosexual relationship, and she doesn't really treat him differently, but this is a nice context to the film, and that really added to the film. And the film, as I said before, the film is acted very well by everybody involved, and the film does look very good, and the film really captures that period in because the film starts from 1917 and finishes in 1927, when Paul Mescal is basically just hitchhiking around Josh O'Connor's birth town, and he's still after all this time he's reminiscing about his friend Josh O'Connor. And there's a nice epilogue scene at the end of the film in 1980, played by Paul Mescal's character is played by Chris Cooper, and he's still, after all these years, he's still reminiscing about his time with Josh O'Connor. But if you stick around to the second half of the film, there are some nice like layers and context in the film that I did find interesting. I give The History of Sound 2.5 stars out of 5. It has a nice lead performance by Paul Mescal, and the film it technically is sound. It looks great and really does capture that period in time very well. But unfortunately, it just doesn't capture the homosexual relationship very well. It just doesn't get enough time for that relationship to fully bloom. And then by the second half of the film, when Paul Mescal's character is really mourning that relationship, we don't really feel the same as him as a viewer. So the film doesn't really capture that essential romance very well. So the film was a little bit disappointing. Thanks for watching. What did you think of The History of Sound? Please comment below what you thought of the film. See you next time. Bye.